You know, when we look at all Soviet posters today, where workers with stern faces hold huge gears in their hands, or when we remember how the first artificial Earth satellite transmitted its famous beep beep to the whole world, a feeling of the absolute triumph of industrial might arises. The great Soviet machine could do everything: forge millions of tons of first-class steel, dam great rivers, build titanium submarines, and hold half the globe in fear with its nuclear triad. But in this grandiose picture, there was one fatal flaw that ultimately sent the entire system off the rails. This vast empire turned out to be practically powerless against an ordinary, microscopic fragment of quartz sand, against a silicon chip. Comrades, have you ever wondered why a country of brilliant physicists and mathematicians, which created the space program, at some point hopelessly fell behind in the computer race? Officially, Soviet newspapers, of course, were silent about this. From the podiums of party congresses, we were taught for decades about the scientific and technological revolution, about the triumph of domestic thought, and about how our factories were about to overtake the rotting capitalism. But behind this ceremonial facade, under the whispers of communal kitchens and in the silence of closed Moscow region research institutes, a real spy detective story was unfolding. A war for microchips, the scale of which surpassed any Hollywood blockbuster. It was a secret operation codenamed Tantal, an unprecedented attempt by Soviet intelligence services to steal Western technology, circumvent international embargoes, and build an entire industry based on so-called reverse engineering, or, to put it simply, total copying. Let's travel back to the early 1960s. It was a time of great hopes, when the Kremlin stars shone especially bright, and Nikita Khrushchev sincerely believed that communism would arrive within the lifetime of the current generation. It was then that the Soviet leadership realized future wars would be won not by tanks or million-strong armies, but by electronics. Missiles had to become precise, radars sharp-eyed, and control systems instantaneous. Without microchips, all Soviet military grandeur turned into a pile of expensive but blind and deaf iron. And then, on Khrushchev's personal initiative and under the curatorship of the incredibly ambitious Minister of the Electronics Industry, Alexander Shokin, the construction of Zelenograd began. This was our answer to America's Silicon Valley, a Soviet Silicon Grad that grew up in the midst of Moscow region forests. The official chronicle of those years is a hymn to Soviet optimism. Thousands of young graduates from the country's best universities went there, attracted not only by the romance of big science, but also by quite earthly benefits: new apartments without years-long waiting lists, and good supplies that almost completely erased the signs of the era of deficit. In the clean rooms of the Angstrom and Micron factories, engineers in white protective suits, reminiscent of spacesuits, started up the first domestic diffusion furnaces. We were told that Soviet science was following its own purely original path. And there was a grain of truth in this. Under the leadership of academician Kamil Valiev, unique theoretical schools were created, and the first series of domestic microchips demonstrated astonishing survivability in conditions of space radiation and terrible Siberian frosts, where the vaunted American counterparts simply failed. But if we descend from the level of official gospel reports to the level of the ordinary smoking rooms in these secret research institutes, the picture appears in a completely different light. Among the development engineers, an astonishing urban legend circulated for years, passed along to one another almost in a whisper. The story went that all of Soviet microelectronics essentially began with two American defectors, Alfred Sarant and Joel Barr. In the US, they were part of the Rosenberg Spy-ring, which passed atomic bomb blueprints to the Soviet Union. When the FBI closed in on them, they fled via Mexico and Prague to the USSR, where they received new names, Philip Steros and Joseph Berg. According to this alternative version, it was Staros who brought the first samples of American microelectronics in his suitcases and literally explained to Khrushchev with his hands that if we didn't create a specialized development center right now, we would forever remain on the sidelines of history. Staros and Berg became cult figures in Zelenograd. Their laboratory created the first Soviet-controlled computing complexes, but the system eventually chewed them up too, stripping them of real authority when the flywheel of bureaucracy spun up to full power. And in those same smoking rooms, bitter, caustic jokes were born about Soviet microchips being the largest microchips in the world, and that they would soon start attaching suitcase handles to them for carrying. This joke was only partly a joke. The rank-and-file engineers knew perfectly well that the actual samples passed down to them from above with the order to replicate suspiciously resembled products from American giants like Texas Instruments or Intel. There was a strict directive emanating from Minister Shokin himself: copy them exactly. Young scientists grumbled, struggled, but continued to examine Western chips. They would be given an imported microchip, its markings would be ground off, and they would be told, make one just like it within 3 months, or put your party card on the table. And no arguments about having different materials, different machinery, and a different topology had any effect on the party leadership. A fast, guaranteed result was needed for the defense industry. And why such a rush? Because the West very quickly understood the threat posed by the Soviet military-industrial complex if it gained access to advanced electronics. As early as 1949, the Coordinating Committee for Multilateral Export Controls, better known as COCOM, was created. This organization erected a deafening wall of technological embargo around the Warsaw Pact countries. Not a single modern transistor, not a single lithography machine, not a single barrel of special ultra-pure chemicals could legally cross the border of the Soviet bloc. Western intelligence agencies vigilantly monitored contracts, and violators faced huge fines and prison sentences. This is precisely where the shadow side of the Soviet state came into play. Deep within the first chief directorate of the KGB, responsible for foreign intelligence, there existed a special unit, the so-called Line X. These people weren't hunting for political secrets or NATO troop deployment plans. Their main targets were the catalogs of Western technology companies, semiconductor specifications, and most importantly, industrial equipment. It was under the curatorship of Line X that the large-scale Operation Tantalus was launched. How did it work in practice? It was a grand chess game played out across the entire territory of Europe. The intelligence service understood that stealing a single chip in a coat pocket was pointless, as it couldn't be used to launch mass production. They needed to steal entire factories, entire technological lines. To do this, the KGB created a giant network of shell companies and front operations all over the world. They were registered in quiet, neutral countries: Switzerland, Austria, Sweden, or Finland. The nominal owners were either recruited agents or simply money-hungry European businessmen willing to turn a blind eye to any law for the sake of super profits. The scheme worked as follows. Some fictitious German or Swiss company would order the latest photolithography equipment from the United States, claiming the machinery was needed, for example, to modernize a watch factory or to produce advanced civilian medical equipment. American regulatory agencies would issue a license, the machines would cross the ocean and arrive at a warehouse in Western Europe. And then, the magic of the special services would begin. At night, in some quiet warehouse near Vienna or Zurich, the crates would be opened. The American high-tech equipment would be relabeled, the documents completely forged, and on paper, the machines would be transformed into mundane textile equipment or machinery for the food industry. This cargo would then be shipped to ports in Sweden or Finland, where Soviet dry cargo ships were already waiting. Customs officials would turn a blind eye, bribed with the necessary sums in hard currency, and the precious machines would sail off to Leningrad or Tallinn, from where they were transported under heavy guard directly to Zelenograd or Minsk, to the Integra plant. The Soviet government spared no expense for Operation Tantalus. The procurement commissions of the Ministry of the Electronics Industry had virtually unlimited budgets in freely convertible currency. If an American diffusion machine cost $50,000 on the open market, Soviet intelligence would unhesitatingly pay $300,000 through a chain of intermediaries. Streams of the party's gold flowed into the pockets of smugglers across Europe. KGB and GRU officers personally supervised the loading of every crate, understanding that their careers, medals, and possibly their lives depended on it. And it worked. In Soviet laboratories, they unpacked the latest American machines from which the factory grease from the plants of California had not yet worn off. But this exciting spy story has another, much more sinister and intriguing version, which intelligence historians still debate. What if Operation Tantalus was completely uncovered by the Americans at a certain point, and they turned it into a grand trap? In the early 1980s, a colossal international scandal erupted, connected to the Vetrov dossier. Vladimir Vetrov, a high-ranking KGB officer working for French intelligence under the codename Farewell, handed over to the West a complete list of Soviet Line X procurement agents, and a detailed inventory of everything the USSR planned to steal in the coming years. And here, according to the memoirs of some high-ranking CIA officials and declassified notes from the then director of the agency, William Casey, the Americans decided not to arrest the Soviet agents immediately. Why shut down a smuggling channel if it can be used for large-scale disinformation and technological sabotage? A hypothesis emerged that the CIA began deliberately feeding Soviet buyers through front companies, altered documentation, defective machinery, and software with built-in logic bombs. These Trojan horses were masterpieces of spycraft. During the testing phase at Soviet research institutes, everything worked perfectly. The circuits passed tests, the programs executed commands, but microscopic changes had been embedded into the microchip structures designed to cause equipment failure under certain conditions. For example, with changes in atmospheric pressure, extreme temperatures, or simply after a certain number of hours of operation. Among historians of aviation and cosmonautics, persistent rumors still circulate that a whole series of mysterious accidents involving Soviet military equipment in the 80s, from failures in early warning systems for missile attacks to crashes of the latest fighter jets, were the consequence of this very CIA secret operation. The most famous legend is connected to the gigantic explosion on a Siberian gas pipeline in 1982. It is claimed that Soviet intelligence services stole Canadian software for controlling pumping stations into which the Americans had preemptively built a hidden defect. At a certain point, the program altered the operating mode of the valves, the pressure increased sharply, and an explosion occurred whose power was perhaps only surpassed by a nuclear one. The official Soviet history, of course, explained this as ordinary negligence by the construction workers, but the shadow of American cyber sabotage still hangs over this event. There is another, purely internal and very cynical conspiracy theory often discussed by researchers of the Soviet nomenclatura. According to it, the top leadership of the Ministry of the Electronic Industry and the overseers from the CPSU, Central Committee themselves, had a vested interest in ensuring the Soviet electronics industry remained in a position of catching up and was dependent on Western supplies. Why? Because Operation Tantalus and the endless purchases through front companies were a goldmine for the Soviet elite. Just think, legal travel abroad during the era of the Iron Curtain was the highest privilege. And here, officials, KGB generals, and trusted academicians sat for years on end in Vienna, Geneva, Zurich, and Helsinki under the pretext of conducting top-secret negotiations and controlling smuggling flows. They had access to unlimited foreign currency accounts, disposed of millions of gold rubles, received huge per diems, bought imported cars, VCRs, and clothes for their families. Why would they support young Soviet scientists who proposed fundamentally new domestic chip architectures? After all, if these scientists succeeded and the USSR created its own independent electronics base, the need for secret operations would disappear. The foreign currency accounts would be closed. The business trips to Paris and Vienna would cease. The nomenclatura perks and foreign goods would vanish. It was simpler and more profitable to endlessly report upwards on the difficulties of circumventing the COCOM embargo, demand new millions of dollars to purchase American secrets, and continue living a beautiful bourgeois life at the state's expense. But let's set aside the conspiracy theories and spy thrillers and look at the harsh reality. Where does the conspiracy actually break down and pure economics and physics begin? Why, having tons of stolen documentation and hundreds of smuggled machines, did the Soviet Union ultimately lose the silicon race? The answer lies in the very paradox of copying. The method of reverse engineering, where a microchip is etched layer by layer with acid, photographed through a microscope, and attempts are made to reproduce the photomasks, only worked effectively in the early stages, when the elements were relatively large. But by the end of the 1970s, the famous Moore's law was in full effect, according to which the number of transistors on a chip was supposed to double every 2 years. Western technologies began to develop at a furious exponential speed. The elements shrank to a few micrometers, and the chips themselves became multi-layered. Copying such a structure by eye became physically impossible. You simply cannot see what is happening inside the silicon wafer, and you do not know the exact doses of impurities introduced into the substrate using ion implantation. As a result, Soviet industry was stuck in a fatal time trap. Let's do the math. It took about a year for an agent of Line X to procure the latest Intel processor on the American market. It took another 6 months for front companies to deliver it to Moscow via convoluted routes across 3 borders. It took another 2 or 3 years for a secret research institute in Zelenograd to study its topology, attempt to decipher its operating logic, and adapt it to our standards. And then, when the Soviet analog finally rolled out of the factory gates to the thunderous applause of the ministry, it turned out that the West had already gone through 2 new generations of microchips in that time. We were always exactly 1 step behind, and that step grew wider every year. But that's not all. Microelectronics isn't just blueprints and schematics. It's the pinnacle of a giant pyramid whose foundation is the entire basic industry of a country. To grow a flawless silicon crystal, you need materials of fantastic, incredible purity. This industry has a term called 9/9 purity, meaning the material must be 99.9999999% pure substance. Only 1 atom of impurity is allowed per billion atoms of silicon. The Soviet chemical industry, stuck in the paradigm of volume and tons, simply could not produce acids, gases, and solvents with that level of purification. Our factories had to purchase Western chemicals by the ton through the same smuggling channels because domestic products would instantly burn and ruin precious silicon wafers. The second stumbling block was the notorious production culture. In American factories in Silicon Valley, they already understood back then that a single speck of dust landing on a photomask would turn an entire batch of processors into silicon garbage. They created extreme hygiene standards. In Soviet clean rooms, however, ventilation often malfunctioned and protocols were violated due to the simple human factor. Engineers recalled how ordinary dust could accumulate in lithography workshops, and workers would enter high-purity zones without proper treatment because the plan is on fire, and the 5-year plan needed to be met urgently. The yield rate of good products at Soviet factories was sometimes as low as 5 or 10% of a batch, while in the West, this figure exceeded 80%. What kind of mass production and cost reduction could there be with such efficiency? But perhaps the most important and destructive factor was the very psychology of the Soviet command administrative system. In a planned economy, initiative was mortally dangerous. Imagine yourself in the place of the director of a major Zelenograd research institute. Your task is to develop a new microchip for the onboard computer of the latest Soviet fighter jet. You have two paths. The first path is to try to create your own unique architecture from scratch. This is a huge risk. You need to conduct thousands of experiments, you could make a mistake, miss deadlines, devour a 1,000,000 ruble budget, and end up with a non-working prototype. What will the ministry do to you? You will be removed from your position, given a party reprimand, stripped of bonuses, or even put on trial for squandering public funds. And you have a second path, which is absolutely safe. You take an American chip that already flies on American planes and has proven its effectiveness. You give it over for copying. And if the copied circuit ends up not working or working poorly, you always have an ironclad alibi before the inspection commissions of the Central Committee. You throw up your hands and say, "Comrades, we did everything exactly according to the American model, an exact copy. But the damned capitalists apparently use some secret alloy or a hidden technology that cannot be reproduced on our equipment. You must understand, it's not our fault. These are the objective difficulties of espionage. And the system forgave you because it was itself built on risk avoidance. Blind imitation was encouraged, while creative courage was punished." The empire voluntarily locked its brilliant scientists in a golden cage of plagiarism, depriving them of the right to make a mistake and, as a consequence, the right to a genuine scientific breakthrough. When the winds of perestroika began to blow in the late 1980s and the Iron Curtain began to slowly lift, the masks were dropped. The Soviet Union suddenly found itself at a loss, having achieved nothing. The lag in microelectronics and computing had become not just chronic, it had become fatal. While Soviet people stood in endless queues for basic food products, the world was rapidly entering a post-industrial digital era. Steel armadas and million-strong armies were being replaced by high-precision weapons, satellite navigation, and personal computers. The Cold War was lost, not on the battlefields, it was lost in the silence of clean rooms, where the Soviet system had failed to grow its own flawless silicon crystal. The history of Operation Tantalus and this entire silicon confrontation is a great and very bitter lesson. It clearly demonstrated that it is impossible to build an advanced technological civilization solely on theft, espionage, and blind copying of others' ideas. High technology is not just a set of stolen blueprints and smuggled machinery. It is an incredibly complex, fragile ecosystem that requires freedom of scientific thought, a flexible and vibrant economy, an absence of fear of authority, and Most importantly, the right to a creative mistake. The USSR possessed colossal resources, the world's best mathematical and physics schools, but the very nature of the totalitarian system turned microelectronics into a hostage of spy games and bureaucratic fear. We were able to steal American machinery, but we found ourselves fundamentally incapable of stealing that dynamism and freedom which created Silicon Valley. And so today, looking at this history from the depths of time, we inevitably come to one very important, almost philosophical question. What do you think, comrades? Did the Soviet Union have even a hypothetical chance of creating its own, completely independent and successful electronics industry if the country's leadership had at the time trusted its own scientists, given them freedom, and not forced them to blindly copy the West? Or was the planned, rigidly centralized economy, in principle, biologically incapable of withstanding the insane pace of the technological race, and did Operation Tantalus merely postpone the inevitable and logical finale for a short while? This is a question with no simple answer, and that is precisely why it is so important for understanding our past and our future. Write what you think about this. Let's discuss it in the comments.